Hello Internet, I am the Disney Brain and welcome to part 2 of S.P.D, a thematic analysis. Last time, you all learned way more about Sky Tate than you probably ever wanted to, but the other Rangers are a little less expansive in terms of their narrative impact. So, let's start this video off by looking at my favorite character from the season, Bridge Carson. With Bridge, you've got a lovable goofball who's always maybe talking a hair too long, much to the annoyance of his teammates. But I think his quirkiness works to the benefit of the season and makes him one of the more original Rangers out there. And there's a neat parallel that goes into his also very unique set of civilian powers. As a person, Bridge is inherently trusting and kind, which makes sense because he can read people's aura and can tell when things seem off. But even though his powers create several plot points for him, he's at his best when either his head or his heart is guiding him, and the season did well to make his genuine nature distinct from Z's, who is also very smart and very kind-hearted, but with her perspective being more rooted in her past. Speaking of Z's past, the Sam two-parter created a season highlight by allowing two characters to connect in a meaningful way. We've seen the whole help the little kid thing done on Power Rangers plenty of times, heck, even Ninja Steel already did it. But sometimes it does create powerful visuals and powerful moments for the characters involved. Here, however, they stepped it up a notch by crafting a more personal story that actually develops the characters. And it's worth repeating that Z's past giving context to her present was a great angle to take with her character. She grew up during a time where the aliens living on Earth thing was still fairly new, and despite her troubled upbringing, she still sees this world as worth protecting. If only so that nobody ever has to suffer the way she did. Which is good, because we all know exactly what can happen to individuals who don't react to getting ostracized nearly as constructively. Z is a great ranger and a great character because she represents a powerful idea, and S.P.D, both the show and the organization, gives her the chance to express and embody that idea. An idea that turned her into the true soul of what S.P.D should strive to accomplish, and because of her, Sam is eventually given the same chance she got to be part of something bigger. But unfortunately, when Sam is revealed to be the Omega Ranger, he actually becomes less interesting as a character. It doesn't help that he can only unmorph into a ball of light, so it's that much harder to see him as the little boy he once was, except all grown up. Not sure why they made that choice, but it was not a good choice. I've said this so much that you're all probably sick and tired of hearing it by now, but the Power Rangers are people first, and spandex wearing superheroes second. Always. So, if it's gonna be Future Sam, then at least have his interactions with Z be more memorable, but they really weren't until the very last scene they shared. As is, Omega Ranger comes out of nowhere and has more of a narrative impact as a kid than he ever had as a Ranger. Just an overly cryptic, overly arrogant, but somehow still bland as all hell caricature of what the real Sam was that never quite fit into the current story. And even Bruce Kalish himself admits that he should have fought harder to make Future Sam a real character. He may not be one of the worst Rangers, but given what they did with him, he's fairly unnecessary. Which is extremely odd for this season because they did so well to make most of their characters necessary, and here we have a completely face value Ranger, except without a face. Next, we have Carrie Underwood's stunt double, Sid Drew, your prototypical blonde rich girl that comes with all the expected personality traits. Joking aside though, I do think Sid had a good starting angle to her character. She had everything growing up. But at some point during all that, she still wanted to risk her life for others as a profession. At least one of her parents was part of S.P.D as well, so she knew what the job entailed. There is a great backstory in there that would probably combine the narrative elements of Summer's past and Wes's character arc. But it's just not explored here because she only ever gets 2 focus episodes, both of which start with her being shallow or selfish or her not placing her priorities in order. That made it harder to say whether she's here because she chose to be, or because maybe her S.P.D veteran parent forced the role onto her. Either pathway would have been worth exploring, but Sid as a character leaves us with more questions than answers. Everyone else, especially Sky, was granted the kind of perception-shattering development that made this season what it was. But as far as character focus episodes go, Sid kind of got the Lucas end of the stick. Both of her focus episodes are better than the ones Lucas got, but relative to the others in this season, it just doesn't stack up. The parents of the B Squad were all part of S.P.D, but despite that, none of them beyond Officer Tate are utilized in the story, and I think Sid becomes a better character if she had that consistent parental angle working for her, just like Scott did, just like Dana did, along with several other Rangers. She has some really good moments, including a great one where she ends up sharing her birthday with Jack. Given how she was presented, I can't think of a better counter to her initial selfishness than that moment. But even with that, as is, this season really doesn't change much if she's not in it, relatively speaking. And last but not least, we've got Jack-o'-lanterns. It's always hard to properly gauge characters like Jack because there's almost a duality to him. On the one hand, as a ranger, I've seen much better. But on the other hand, as a character, he's one of the better ones. Just like how Sky's stoic, rigid, and uncompromising worldview was needed in S.P.D, you also needed Jack, who was anything but. As one commenter wisely pointed out in part 1, it's a lot like the Kirk-Spock dynamic of early Star Trek. Jack often criticizes commands. He never took his role seriously in the beginning, and many times his priorities are clearly elsewhere. But that made him interesting. It made him real. It also made him and Sky's clash perfect as a way to develop both characters, because he's many of the things Sky isn't. If you'll recall, Jack wouldn't even be the Red Ranger if he wasn't arrested, and he still probably wouldn't have agreed to do it if Boom didn't connect with him instantly. He's not exactly here because of the goodness of his heart initially. He's here in part because he's being forced to do this. There are plenty of early signs as to why he'd make a good ranger anyways, but the point is, the reasons behind his inclusion provide context for his actions. This is essentially a good version of the character arc they could have done with any of the Samurai Rangers, all of which are also not here completely by choice, except for Antonio. Unlike Sky, Jack has seen S.P.D on both sides and doesn't really share Z's more wide-eyed enthusiasm for making a bigger difference. Because of that, it makes sense as to why he'd be critical, why he would clash with Sky and Kruger, and why he would screw up before eventually getting the hang of things. But even then, he knows that S.P.D is not a permanent thing for him. His beginning, his middle, his end, everything about how Jack develops and progresses makes sense. His at times questionable dedication may not make him a great leader, despite a handful of really great moments, but there's a lot more depth to him than just that. And because S.P.D did something with that depth, they created a character unlike any the Ranger world has ever seen. A character who, just like his team, proved to be flawed in his own ways, but then the season used those flaws in interesting ways to create great character dynamics and great storylines. And despite his shortcomings, he still became everything Kruger thought he could be, and maybe more. And when his good work was done, he earned what he didn't really have in episode 2. He earned a real choice. Some Rangers are the kind of characters that could do this job forever if asked. Carter is a great example of that. But not every Ranger is built like him, and that's okay. Because what's more important is to have great, unique, distinct characters, even if that means choosing to leave Ranger duties behind. But even after leaving, Jack still finds a new passion in helping provide clothes to the homeless, a great callback to his first moment of selfless charity. All of this goes back to the brilliance, both in conception and execution, of making these Rangers the B Squad. They're not just the backups, they are presented in such a way that you can see why they'd be backups. And that's good, because that gave the season plenty of avenues for development. And that also made their fight against and eventual defeat of the A Squad that much more meaningful. All their fights, all their battles, all added up to this moment. They needed to prove that they could not just match up with the so-called best of S.P.D, but beat them. Prove to them why they chose wrong when they chose Grum. In much the same way that Casey had to prove how far he'd come when he faced Jared again, S.P.D as a team had to prove how far they've come. And how far they've come matters more in this season because S.P.D is a very public entity, meaning that civilians know or can at least figure out who the Rangers really are. That makes sense here versus the usual secret identities, because if tax dollars are going to help run this very expensive base, then people should know who their protectors are. This angle creates accountability, but only in theory. The fact is, it's kind of a moot point in Power Rangers, since for the most part, the organization leaders already handled that without any outside noise, especially Kruger, who is one of the best, if not the best, Ranger mentor. And on top of that, we never really hear any negative outside noise, because this franchise has never attempted anything close to the friend or foe plot point. But I do think it would be a good story angle for Power Rangers to take down the line, since there's probably many people in their world who wish they would just end the fighting in episode 2 so no more buildings get torn down. Anytime we see a higher up or a news report, they all praise the Rangers. But what if one of them didn't? it could be worth diving into. Getting back to the season, S.P.D. is more than great concepts and great characters. The characters are cultivated through the concepts, which leads us to the major defining theme of the season. Everyone, for better and for worse, is more than what they seem. Male, female, black, white, earthling, alien, A squad, B squad, does not matter. What matters most in this season and in this new world is being able to do your job and do it right. You'll stumble, you'll fall, you'll make mistakes, everyone does, but then you'll learn, you'll grow, you'll be challenged, and you'll change. You'll develop into better rangers, better heroes than you ever were on day one, because it's not about the initial perception, it's about the totality of who you are. And given your added perspective, it then becomes about the totality of the team you're on. That's what the Haven known as New Tech City is all about at its most ideal. That's what Space Patrol Delta is all about. Both the city and the organization praise diversity of thought and decry ignorance, and that's why Power Rangers S.P.D., one of the most ambitious, creative, intelligent, engaging, and forward-thinking seasons ever, is all-time great. But it's not all-time great all the time, as with any season. There's just no getting around Sid and Omega being so incongruous character-wise to the rest of the show. There's just too much missing or misplaced with their progressions. Also, S.P.D. had an incredible start, maybe one of the best first halves of a season ever, but then things got a little messy down the stretch and the episode quality starts to go down as the episode number goes up, with reflection and endings being clear exceptions. But with S.P.D., maybe more so than any other Disney-era season, several forgettable episodes had something to say. Even the lesser episodes that are just killing time usually aren't moronic or complete aberrations of concept, but just the kind of day-to-day filler you might expect when things aren't as exciting at HQ. So, as odd as it sounds, I'm actually giving S.P.D. credit for having lackluster episodes that aren't as lackluster as they could have been. Just for fun, allow me to theorize on any possible Time Force connections, although I doubt my findings will be new. So, as we know, Sky's dad was the S.P.D. Red Ranger who just so happens to be wearing Wes's old uniform, but clearly isn't Wes. Coincidence? Maybe, but here's the thing. Time Force started and ended in the year 2001, the same year Kruger starts establishing S.P.D.'s Earth branch. What's more, in Time Force, Mr. Collins and Dr. Zaskin were constantly looking to use Ranger tech to fortify their city defenses. Said defenses primarily came in the form of the Silver Guardians, an organization that Wes joins after Time Force officially ends. The Silver Guardians protect the city, with 2 Power Rangers at the helm, and also rely on a science division that's already years ahead of its time. To me, it makes perfect sense that such an advanced science division would be sought out by a younger Doggy Kruger to create new advancements in citywide protection, i.e. improve the brand new S.P.D. And if Wes eventually agreed to take part in all this, then he could have donated his morpher for S.P.D. to replicate, which in turn would lead to Mr. Tate becoming a Ranger. It would also mean Wes would still have the original morpher for his team-up appearances. From there, S.P.D. creates new morphers and new weapons from Year 3000 technology, something Biolab already attempted in Time Force, thus leading to the Delta morphers, the Zords, and everything else. And doesn't it just figure that a laid-back Red Ranger and a much stricter Ranger with a rough past would become vital character dynamics in both seasons? And the timing seems to work out. Heck, even the social subtext present in both seasons is similar, except it's angled very differently in each. We know that they just reused the Time Force suit because props are reused all the time to cut costs. But the production team could have used any suit. They could have given Mr. Tate Charlie's A-Squad suit for the one flashback he's in, or even borrowed a Sentai suit, thus eliminating any connection to Ranger lore. But they didn't. So it really felt like the S.P.D. writers were trying to tell us something with this decision. All in all, S.P.D. for me serves as an interesting counter between my early Ranger fandom and my more recent Ranger fandom. I watched S.P.D. while it was airing, and I did not care for it too much. And a lot of that was Sky being an asshole, Jack being lazy, and Sid being, well, Sid. Even back then, I loved Bridge, but not enough to keep me invested in where these other characters could go. But nowadays, I overthink everything. So now I watch a season like S.P.D. and all of these ideas and dynamics and thematic constructs and narratives and interesting story elements just leap right off the screen. Stuff that Rangers has never really done before, but in many cases, they were doing it well. this season was a uniquely challenging one for all the right reasons. And, as is the nature of S.P.D, my initial impression of it could not have been more divergent than my current more complete thoughts. Although, my thoughts on the amazing theme song never changed, always loved this season's opening. But you could say that I had to go through my own arc of sorts before realizing there's a ton of value here, a ton of well thought out ideas and stories here, several all-time great characters here. Nothing about this season reveals itself completely in the first few episodes, but along the way, Space Patrol Delta proves to be exactly what it's supposed to be. And that was S.P.D, a thematic analysis, although it felt more like a conceptual analysis, but minor details. Next on the docket is more than likely another anime video, topic still undecided, and then we return to the top 10 as we count down the best of the best added in 6th Rangers. And yes, I'm seeing the Ninja Storm request, so don't worry, we'll get there too. But until then, thanks for watching.